So I think the first major pro of reuse is the reduction in embodied emissions. If you're reusing a building, you need a far less steel, far less concrete. About 20% of the emissions of a building over its life cycle come during that embodied phase. And so right away, you're taking out a significant chunk of the emissions. Another advantage of reuse is potentially the kind of second order effect on emissions. When you're building or reusing in potentially higher density, already broadly kind of infrastructure developed parts of the city. If you are developing in those areas where it's medium or high density, you reduce transportation emissions, you reduce emissions associated with other forms of infrastructure. And so there are a lot of benefits of the reuse. The challenge is, of course, you may be having to decarbonize a building that's a bit older, right? Maybe it's a little less energy efficient, it's poorly insulated, it's a bit harder to get the access potentially to put in a heat pump or other electrification measure. And so, I think our research shows that the most buildings, even buildings that are a bit older, that deal with some of those legacy issues, can be decarbonized from an operational emissions perspective for, call it financially neutral or at financially neutral outcomes. And so, if you are able to do that operational emissions reduction, there is a lot of benefits of that kind of reuse. The internal carbon price is a very effective strategy to very quickly say, we value emissions reduction and we value it in everything we do across our company. And it creates that kind of economic incentive for independent decision making to be made across a company or a portfolio, taking into account the emissions of whatever decision is being made. And so whether it's you're doing a retrofit, calculating the carbon price impact, you're taking that into account in the retrofit economics. You're doing a new build, you're calculating the carbon price impact, you're taking that into the new build, taking that into account in the new build economics. So it's a great way just to say, hey, we care about this and we value it in economic terms. We want you to make different decisions by taking that into account. There are other ways to do it as well, right? Even in the absence of a carbon price, whether that be external or internal, our view is that, especially when it comes to operational emissions again, there are ways to do it that even without a carbon price are financially beneficial. And so, the message I wouldn't want to be taken is that you need a carbon price to decarbonize. I think in many cases, doing efficiency measures and electrification measures, even without incentives, even without a carbon price, even without a green premium, are just the right decision to be made from in purely economic terms for many buildings and portfolios. Yeah, so this is a very debated area, as you know, offsets, and there's debates around many different things. One of the debates is around the additionality and traceability of more traditional offsets. So if you use the classic example of planting the tree, the question is, does that tree get burned down later? Would that tree have been planted otherwise? By planting that tree, is some other tree being cut down? And so those questions around additionality and traceability at the offsets become very important. There are also challenges, though, on the other hand, with some of the more technological approach to offsets. So, for example, direct air capture, the cost per ton of CO2 captured is still very high, right? And there needs to be a pretty aggressive learning curve and scaling of some of those technologies to bring down those costs. Now, some of those things are happening. You see a number of initiatives where major corporates like ourselves or others are making commitments to purchasing the credits associated with those reductions, offtake agreements to try and bring some of those technologies to scale. So I think on the industrial technology offset side of things, there's going to be technological improvement. There's going to be returns to scale. I also think there's an opportunity on the other side of the equation for there to be innovation. In the case of nature-based solutions, that innovation may be more in innovation around how do we address those traceability issues? How do we address those additionality issues? Can we use things like satellite imaging, digital databases to make sure that our nature-based offsets are being improved in terms of their credibility? So I think on both sides of, all dimensions of the broader offsets market, there's a lot of room for innovation. When it comes to real estate specifically, I think real estate is likely going to have to resort to offsets, mostly in the case of embodied carbon, hard to abate things such as steel and cement. I think the encouragement should be to just actually get the real emissions out when it comes to those things you can decarbonize and not have to resort to offsets. So things like reducing operational emissions. There are a range of exciting developments, both on the embodied carbon side and on the operational emissions side. I think on the operational emissions side, first, there are things like building energy management systems, the just continued development of existing technology like heat pumps. If you talk to a lot of folks that looked at heat pumps 5 or 10 years ago, they'll say, well, they don't work in cold climates. This is becoming less and less true, and heat pumps are expanding their efficiency, they're improving their cost, and are becoming a really attractive offering, even just on a standalone, economic basis, not taking into account emissions. So on the operational side, there's a bunch, and then the operational side, it is less an issue of new technology. It is more an issue of deploying existing technology. We can get to net zero with existing technology, right? We don't need some newfangled invention to come in, although those will help, right? On the embodied side, that's where we really need some technological innovation. Things like low emissions steel, low emissions cement. There's a range of ideas, prototypes, etc., being experimented with in both of those areas. And then there's also a range of new technologies or approaches in the actual design and construction methods. So things like modular offsite design, which can both reduce materials waste, but also reduce the emissions associated with on-site construction. So hopefully on the embodied side, we're able to progress the technology to a point where we can have the building materials be lower emissions, and the building construction methods also be more efficient. Yeah, so there's certainly a bunch of different infrastructure supports required for real estate to reach net zero. Those can be as simple as the grid, right? There needs to be a significant electrification that occurs, which is going to put pressures on the grid, right, or require improvements to the grid. Both in terms of the capacity of the grid, but also in terms of things like storage to allow a higher renewables share at the grid level. So there's grid infrastructure that is certainly going to be required, and then there's also infrastructure such as district heating or cooling, which you mentioned. So district heating tends to be a little bit more applicable or more economic where the density makes sense, and so if you look at overall economic the shares of real estate emissions that will be addressed through things like district heating, in most geographies it's not the majority necessarily, but it is an important component of it. And so there will be the requirement for upgrades to existing systems, for development of new systems, especially as you have new kind of medium high density developments come online. So it is going to be a pretty important piece of the picture.